The deep sound of drums echoes through the valley. The ground trembles as if the earth itself were breathing. Men haul colossal stones, heavy beams rise toward the clouded sky. Slowly, an immense castle takes shape in the heart of feudal Japan. The air carries both glory and tension. Every strike of the hammer, every stake driven into the soil, hides a shadowed secret. While the workers sweat and the samurai watch with pride, something unseen unfolds beneath it all, a silent pact between life and stone. For to raise such grand structures, human effort and construction skill alone were never enough. It required something more, something that brushed against the inexplicable, the spiritual, and often the cruel. And so I ask you, could you live peacefully, knowing that beneath your feet a life was buried to hold the ground you stand on? Feudal Japan was a land carved by blood and instability. For centuries, the country remained divided among rival samurai clans, each fighting for territory, honor, and power. Civil wars were constant, and loyalty could shift sides overnight. In this reality, to live meant to coexist with the fear of invasions, betrayals, and battles that could wipe entire villages from the map. The feudal lords, the daimyo, needed more than warriors. They needed visible symbols of authority. It was in this setting that monumental constructions became essential. Castles rising like near impenetrable fortresses, bridges linking strategic lands, and walls promising safety from invaders. More than mere structures of stone and wood, these projects were messages. They declared, here there is order, here there is power. Here, entry does not come easily, but there was a problem. Japan's unstable terrain. Earthquakes, floods, and its rugged mountains made engineering a daunting challenge. Many castles collapsed, many bridges failed to endure. And for a people deeply connected to the spiritual and the supernatural, such disasters were not seen as mere technical flaws, but as signs of divine wrath, or the absence of spiritual protection. From this mixture of fear, faith, and the hunger for control was born an obsession with absolute stability. Building a fortress was not enough. It had to withstand both visible enemies and the invisible. And it was precisely here that a dark practice emerged, one that would forever stain history. The ritual of Hitobashira, the human pillars. The word Hitobashira can be translated literally as human pillars. It is neither a metaphor nor an exaggerated legend. In significant constructions of feudal Japan, people were truly buried alive within the foundations of castles, bridges, and walls. The idea was simple and brutal. Just as a stone column supported a structure, it was believed that the sacrifice of a human life would serve as a spiritual pillar, ensuring strength, stability, and protection. In the mindset of the time, the physical world and the spiritual world were inseparable. Every landslide, every bridge that collapsed, every castle that crumbled during an earthquake was seen as a sign that something beyond engineering had failed. The solution, then, was not only to reinforce the timber or align the stones more carefully, but to appease the gods and unseen spirits that governed the fate of such works. Hitobashira emerged precisely from this fusion of religion, superstition, and primitive engineering. In Shinto belief, the world was inhabited by countless kami, spirits and deities tied to nature. If a castle was built on unstable ground, it was thought that the spirit of the earth needed to be fed with an offering worthy enough, and no offering was more powerful than human life itself. The ritual also carried a symbolic meaning. The sacrificed body became part of the structure. The victim's blood, bones, and very soul were absorbed into the construction, making it alive, and therefore stronger. It was a macabre reasoning, but one that reflected the logic of the age. To secure the stability of many, the sacrifice of a few was acceptable. What is most disturbing is how natural the practice seemed within the feudal mentality. For rulers, it was both a demonstration of devotion to the gods and of political power. For the common people, it was a mixture of terror and resignation. After all, if a castle stood firm against earthquakes, or a bridge endured for generations, the sacrifice was seen as necessary, even just. Thus, Hitobashira cannot be understood merely as an isolated act of cruelty. It was the reflection of an era in which religion, fear, and science still walked hand in hand. An era when the price of stability could quite literally be a human life. The ritual of Hitobashira did not remain confined to ancient records. It survived through legends that crossed centuries, blurring the line between myth and reality. These stories were told to explain tragedies, justify local superstitions, and remind people that behind every solid wall, there might be a life entombed. One of the most well-known legends involves the construction of the Matsue Ohashi Bridge in Shimane Prefecture. During its building, engineers faced repeated collapses. The structure would not hold, the water swept away the foundations, and the people began to believe that spiritual forces were preventing its completion. The solution they chose was terrifying: to bury a living person within the bridge's pillars. Accounts say that victims were often unlucky peasants or prisoners with no future. Buried while still breathing, they became the spiritual pillar of the structure. The bridge was finally completed and endured, and according to oral tradition, its price was paid with human lives sealed inside its core. Even today, some claim that at night, whispers can be heard rising from the river, like laments trapped beneath the water. Perhaps the most famous story tied to Hitobashira is that of Maruoka Castle, built in the 16th century. When construction began, the walls simply refused to rise. Every attempt ended in collapse. Desperate, those in charge resorted to human sacrifice. The chosen victim was a poor woman named Oshizu, a single mother, who agreed to be buried alive in exchange for the promise that her son would be elevated to the rank of samurai. Oshizu was entombed within the castle's foundation, becoming a human pillar. At last, the fortress was completed successfully. But the promise made to her was never kept. Her son was abandoned in poverty. Enraged, Oshizu's spirit was said to haunt the castle. Legend tells that on rainy days, tears streamed down its walls, weakening them until they collapsed. This phenomenon became known as the Tears of Oshizu, and even after centuries, it remains a symbol of the curse said to hang over the castle. Beyond grand monuments, small villages carried their own versions of Hitobashira. Tales spoke of wells that demanded the sacrifice of young lives so they would never run dry, of dams that only held firm after a body was cast into the waters, of rural bridges where animals refused to cross, as if sensing the presence of someone buried beneath the ground. These stories, scattered across Japan's countryside, reinforced a collective fear. In any great construction, it was possible that a neighbor, a relative, or even you could be chosen as the human pillar. Whether true or not, these legends reveal how deeply Hitobashira was etched into the popular imagination. More than forgotten rituals, they became warnings. Every stone might conceal a life, sacrificed in silence. Hitobashira was not merely an act of cruelty, it carried a profound symbolic weight within the mindset of feudal Japan. To understand this ritual, one must dive into the way the Japanese of old interpreted the relationship between life, nature, and spirituality. In Shintoism, Japan's traditional religion, the world was filled with kami, spirits and deities inhabiting rivers, mountains, stones, forests, and even man-made structures. Nothing was purely material. Every space carried a spiritual presence that demanded respect. When a castle, a bridge, or a wall was raised, it was not only an act of construction, it was a negotiation with the unseen world. Within this context, the human body as an offering became the ultimate sacrifice. Animals could be slain, objects could be gifted, but no offering was considered as powerful as human life itself. The spilled blood, the imprisoned soul, all of it was perceived as a spiritual contract. In exchange for this person's life, we asked the gods to keep this work strong and protected. There was also a collective logic behind it. The suffering of one individual was interpreted as an investment in the well-being of all. If a castle withstood invasions, if a bridge stood firm for generations, then the sacrifice of a single life was justified in the feudal mentality. It reflected a ritualistic notion that the stability of the many could only be built upon the pain of the few, and this way of thinking was not exclusive to Japan. Around the world we find echoes of the same reasoning. What makes Hitobashira distinct is its direct connection to architecture. It was not merely a religious ritual, but a component of Japan's spiritual engineering. The sacrificed body literally became part of the structure, transforming flesh and bone into stone and timber through symbolism. In other words, every structure marked by Hitobashira was more than a military or political monument. It was also a permanent altar raised upon a human life. A grim reminder that the stability of those walls may have cost more than sweat and labor, it may have cost human blood. If the walls and bridges of feudal Japan were built upon human lives, one inevitable question arises. Who were these people sacrificed? In most accounts, the victims were the most vulnerable of society. Poor peasants, indebted servants, prisoners of war, people without political power, without a voice, without anyone to defend them. They were seen as disposable pieces on a board controlled by the daimyo and their architects. To the elite, the worth of a common life meant nothing compared to the glory of a castle that might endure for generations. But not all victims came from the margins. Some legends speak of women chosen by fate. It was often believed that a young and pure life held stronger spiritual power to appease the kami. Thus, maidens were sometimes offered through grim lotteries, or even willingly, in exchange for promises of rewards for their families, as in the famous story of Oshizu at Maruoka Castle. The selection process varied. In some villages, a ritual akin to a wheel of fate was performed, names were drawn, and the chosen one could not escape. In other cases, prisoners were used as bargaining chips. Better to bury them alive than to waste resources keeping them confined. There are also accounts of false promises, where families were convinced that sacrifice would bring them honor or social benefits. The preparation for the ritual was cold and merciless. Victims were not simply executed, they were placed within the foundations while still alive, in narrow pits, so their bodies would merge with the structure. Small offerings were often placed alongside them, grains of rice, coins, protective charms, as if these objects could guide the soul. Then earth and stone slowly covered them, until their screams were silenced forever. And how did the people react to all this? With silence and fear. There was no space for questioning. To defy the ritual was to defy the gods, and worse, to defy the feudal lords. The people accepted the sacrifice as an inevitable part of life, just as they accepted crushing taxes or conscription into war. Deep down, everyone knew that one day it could be their turn, or the turn of someone they loved. Fear became an invisible prison, as solid as the walls raised over the victims. Hitobashira left a double scar, on the body of the one buried alive, and on the collective mind of those who survived, forced to carry the memory of the sacrifice. It was a constant reminder that human life, in that era, could be reduced to nothing more than an invisible pillar, holding up the weight of another's ambition. Hitobashira did not end when the last stone was laid over the victim. On the contrary, for many the true weight of the ritual only began afterward. While the sacrifices were believed to bring stability to the structures, there was also the fear that the spirits of the victims would never rest in peace. Many of the sites said to host the ritual became associated with recurring tragedies. Castles suffering unexplained fires, walls cracking for no apparent reason, bridges collapsing on calm days. People interpreted these events not as mere structural failures, but as signs of a curse, the vengeance of those buried against their will. These narratives spread quickly, fueled by oral tradition. Every new collapse was not just a misfortune, it was living proof that the spiritual debt had not yet been paid. Restless ghosts. The most terrifying stories involved apparitions. At Maruoka Castle, it was said that Oshizu's tears ran down the walls on rainy days, weakening the structure as if her spirit sought to destroy what had imprisoned her. At Matsue Ohashi Bridge, travelers swore they heard moans rising from the water, as if the victims buried in the pillars were still crying for help. Some accounts tell of pale figures walking along the bridge, only to vanish into the morning mist. Even in small villages, legends claim that children disappeared near ancient dams, pulled by invisible hands from the depths. In popular imagination, these were the spirits of the sacrificed, trying to drag others with them to ease their loneliness. These stories did not remain in the past. Hitobashira became a cultural inheritance of fear. Grandparents told their grandchildren, parents warned their children not to play near certain places, and entire villages avoided speaking too much about constructions tied to human sacrifice. The silence surrounding the subject was both a form of respect and self-preservation. Even centuries later, when the practice had long been abolished, the memory remained alive. The fear persisted not only through legends, but through the collective sense that beneath every solid stone of ancient Japan, a secret was buried. Thus, Hitobashira was not merely a dark ritual. It left scars in the Japanese imagination, turning constructions into ambiguous symbols. At once, monuments of power and invisible tombs, guarded by ghosts that could never rest. Over the centuries, Japan began to change. The country that had once lived in constant warfare entered periods of greater stability, especially during the Edo period, 1603-1868, when the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated its power and imposed a relative peace across the land. This political transformation was accompanied by something essential: advances in engineering and scientific thought. Builders, who had once relied almost as much on superstition as on technique, began adopting more sophisticated methods. Drainage systems, stronger foundations, and the use of durable materials reduced the risk of collapse. Gradually, the belief that a human body was necessary to keep a structure standing gave way to calculations and practical knowledge. But it was not only science that undermined Hitobashira. Japanese culture itself began to view the practice as taboo. The rise of Buddhism, which preached respect for life and compassion for human suffering, clashed with the brutality of the sacrifices. To bury someone alive came to be seen not as a noble offering, but as a spiritual stain capable of bringing misfortune, rather than preventing it. Over time, the ritual ceased to be practiced officially. The state and local leaders banned such sacrifices, and any mention of them was hidden or softened. Yet the stories endured, not in official documents, but in the collective memory, passed down from generation to generation. Hitobashira ceased to exist as a real practice, but it never fully disappeared from the imagination. What had once been seen as a necessity was now remembered as a shameful and cruel act that should never be repeated. It became taboo, a cultural ghost that Japan preferred to bury alongside its victims, yet which still resurfaces today in legends, local traditions, and wary glances at ancient constructions. In other words, Hitobashira officially died with the rise of engineering and cultural change, but it lived on as a myth, a shadow that still reminds us of the human price paid in the pursuit of stability. Even centuries after the practice ended, Hitobashira remains alive in the Japanese imagination. The places where, according to legend, human lives were buried still carry a dual aura: respect and fear. Castles like Maruoka and bridges like Matsue Ohashi are not just tourist attractions. For many visitors, they are also silent altars, charged with spiritual energy. In some regions, locals avoid speaking about the subject directly, as if mentioning the sacrifices might awaken dormant ghosts. In others, discreet ceremonies are performed to appease the spirits, even if no one openly admits to believing in it. This mix of reverence and fear shows how myth and reality intertwine. From a historical perspective, there's no denying that human sacrifice practices existed in various cultures, and feudal Japan was no exception. But the lack of detailed official records makes it impossible to completely separate documented fact from legend passed down orally. And perhaps this is precisely where the power of Hitobashira lies. It has become a cultural symbol, a scar on the collective memory. It does not matter whether all the stories were true, or if some were born merely to explain natural tragedies. What matters is that, for the people, every stone, every wall, and every ancient bridge could conceal a life buried in silence. Even today, tour guides recount these stories to visitors, blending history with horror. Films, books, and anime have explored the theme, reinforcing the myth. And for those living near these sites, the feeling persists. There is something there that does not belong solely to the physical world. The legacy of Hitobashira is this: to remind us that the stability of great constructions may have come at the highest possible price, a human life. In the end, the stones remain, the castles endure, but the echo of the victims never completely fades.